like I was saying before, I'm getting 50 pitches a day. I could spend all 8 hours of my working day reading those 50 emails. So that kind of the shorter and more efficient the pitches, the better.
Welcome to Startup Health Now, the podcast where we talk to the entrepreneurs shaping the future of health and discuss the health moonshots they're working to achieve. I'm your host, Logan Plaster. On this week's episode, we're diving deep under the hood to talk about practical strategies for getting your startup's story out into the world. For those insights, we turned to Megan Hernbroth, the reporter who covers health tech and venture capital for Business Insider. Megan's work has run the gamut from Silicon Valley PR to now writing for a website that gets 375 million unique visitors per month. What you're about to hear is an excerpt from an expert office hour session hosted by Startup Health and attended by a group of founders from the Startup Health portfolio. In addition to my interview with Megan, you'll get to hear directly from founders some of the day-to-day challenges they face in sharing their stories with the world and Megan's sage advice. I hope you enjoy. Megan, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's start with some numbers, with some basics. Tell us, how many pitches do you get each week?
Oh man, I bet my inbox probably rivals that of a prominent venture capitalist with the number of unsolicited pitches I'm getting. But generally, I get between 50 and 100
per week. So per week, 50 to 100 pitches, particularly in your niche. This isn't just like general pitches, like actually in the industry. And how much content are you producing, and how much content, kind of like, what does that funnel look like?
Yeah, so not many. The conversion rate is pretty small. I would say I tend to write about a story or two a week. It ranges kind of, like I was saying, my goals are based on subscriptions. So it's not as closely tied to page views or clicks or anything like that. And those folks write at least a story a day, if not 2 to 3 stories per day. So I think their conversion rate is much higher. Whereas mine is, we go for more the quality in-depth reporting over the quantity.
Got it. Why is it important for a company to understand that funnel and kind of how that looks? 100 stories pitched a week versus kind of the 2 that you're working on.
Yeah, so it's an interesting balance. I think it kind of brings in that timeliness aspect. If you can prove in your pitch that what you're trying to talk about, or your company or your fundraise or whatever it might be is timely, that usually kind of kicks it back up to the top of my to-do list, because I'm working with such high volumes. That list gets pretty daunting pretty quickly. So the more kind of relevant and interesting the pitch can be, the more likely it is to get kind of opened and filed away for something for me to work on in the future.
Yeah. You mentioned timeliness. You mentioned interesting, relevant. That kind of makes me think about just like in journalism, studying the basics of newsworthiness, news value. So like, how do you think about newsworthiness? A lot of times people think that their story is the most important story in the world. And it is sometimes, but like talk us through kind of your process for judging newsworthiness.
Yeah, so I work pretty closely with my editor to kind of iron out that process. I think things that are relevant to today are always going to do well. So, for example, today was the Supreme Court hearing on the ACA. I cover healthcare, so I'm just kind of keeping an eye on if there's anything tangentially related, given that it's the news of the day. Going into the election, it was similar. We were looking at different outcomes for digital health, even kind of going as far as to looking at, what could a universal broadband mandate look like, and what does that mean for digital health companies that rely on access and stuff like that. So being able to kind of tie into current events, I know those 2 examples were politics, but hopefully that is less of a news item moving forward. So that would be something more along the lines of, you're looking at is a new rule coming down? Is there a new, is there a new hospital system? Is there a new entrant? Like, is there news on coronavirus? Is there vaccine news? That kind of thing. And being able to tie in whatever you're trying to pitch with something along those lines, because that's more likely to then get looped into a story that's either already in the works or make it appealing enough to drop whatever I'm currently working on to pick up something else.
Interesting. So I'm hearing a suggestion here to read the news, stay very current, and make sure your pitch really ties into something not just timely, but sort of hyper timely. Like, you're probably looking for things that tie into today.
Yeah. I've noticed I've been getting a lot of pitches that are kind of 2 or 3 days stale recently. And that's, it would have been helpful to have them as it was happening. But of course it's, I know the kind of iterations that these pitches have to go to, and it's not always the quickest mechanism. So sometimes it helps to be kind of the first one in the inbox. If you're kind of the first person that's like, hey, I have an expert that can talk to you about X, that's the person I'll pick up the phone and call.
Interesting. So there's sort of an element of trying to read the tea leaves and get ahead of something.
Yes.
You want to, if you can't be first, kind of precede it a little bit. Megan, what are some of the current trends? We just talked about newsworthiness in general, and you just mentioned the ACA and kind of tying it into politics, but more in terms of technology, trends in healthcare overall. What are you seeing? What's interesting to you right now?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 big buckets that I'm looking at right now. I think there's this movement towards very hyper-specific care in the digital health world. And I think this mass adoption of telemedicine and virtual care has really kind of ushered that in a little bit quicker than it would have otherwise. So now you see folks that are, looking at, specific healthcare specific to the LGBT community. You have women's health, which has kind of been a rising tide the last couple of years, along with fertility treatment for all parents and specific conditions, and just kind of a way to kind of really, break out these different groups in terms of providing the best healthcare for what those groups' needs are. So I'm paying attention to that and kind of seeing how that evolves over the next 6 to 12 months in terms of both virtual care, but also in primary care and physical locations and that kind of thing.
Okay.
The other big one that I'm looking at is groups that rely on, or companies that rely on gig workers. So I'm thinking like the Papas of the world, BetterHelp, kind of these tech platforms, kind of, I don't want to say like the Uber of, but this reliance on gig workers to kind of fill the gaps where maybe traditional healthcare has lagged behind, and looking at what that means longer term.
Interesting. I guess a corollary to that is, are there some themes that you kind of quickly pass on? That if an entrepreneur found themselves within that, they might want to kind of reframe?
I think the biggest, where I no longer take pitches about wellness, we'll call it that, and kind of at-home connected fitness. Those stories have kind of been told in the first few months of the pandemic.
Okay.
Just kind of, tips for meditation and supplements and stuff that's not necessarily science-backed is something that I'm starting to stray away from in terms of, I've seen a lot. I've also gotten so many pitches about like CBD and supplements and like that. And we have a fantastic team at Business Insider that covers cannabis specifically. So that's not my realm.
That brings up a great point of knowing who you're pitching to. So how important is it for the person trying to get their story out there to read your work, to kind of know you, what you cover, your beat, what you've written in the past? How valuable is that? And I guess the follow-up there is, thoughts on strategies for going a layer deeper, like getting to know, like, who is the right reporter for this?
Yeah, so I think it's very important. At least on my team, we do kind of knowledge share among the team. So say if something's not necessarily a great fit for me, I'll pass it to other folks on my team, seeing if anyone else is interested. But if it's something where it's totally not like if I've gotten a lot of AI pitches recently where it's like that's not even close to my expertise. So that would be something where I wouldn't even know who to send it to within Business Insider, because we're a pretty big team. So knowing who you're pitching is very, very helpful, and it increases your odds, essentially of getting it through kind of to the finish line and published.
So, okay, we talked about timeliness, how critical that is. Knowing the reporter that you're pitching into, what do they cover? What have they already recently covered? Kind of knowing some of those macro trends, kind of what's hot, what's not at the moment. What else goes into a successful pitch?
Yeah, I think making sure all your information is easily available. So kind of answering that who, what, where, when, why group of questions kind of right up front is very helpful. So like I was saying before, I'm getting 50 pitches a day. I could spend all 8 hours of my working day reading those 50 emails. So that kind of the shorter and more efficient the pitches, the better. It's more likely to get opened and considered more so than if I have to read a full novel. But making sure, you have a spokesperson available, whether that's a CEO, a founder, an investor, some other stakeholder, is always great. Like we very rarely take statements that are pre-written in email or something like that. If it's like, hey, if you were watching the ACA coverage today, here's our statement. Kind of thing. We don't tend to cover those because it's assumed that you've sent that to many reporters. So it does us know, like we don't kind of get ahead of anything by publishing something like that.
Got it. Well, you bring up an interesting point there. Your emphasis on getting ahead of a story, on some level of exclusivity. When you're sending out a press release, you're trying to cast a pretty wide net. And so you're not really thinking about exclusivity and the power of that. So maybe you could speak to that for a minute and kind of how should a founder think through that? Yeah.
So for Business Insider, I would say we almost always ask for an exclusive, which means in a true exclusive, in that, the news is not shared with anyone else ahead of time. I have had some instances where folks are like, well, you have exclusive access to this specific data point or this specific spokesperson. That does not an exclusive make, unfortunately. So it's full access to whatever the news is, as kind of the only news outlet. I've also had instances where folks are like, oh, well, you're the business exclusive, and we gave TechCrunch the tech exclusive. As someone with a background in PR, I have done that. So it makes sense when you're in the trenches and you're like, yeah, of course. But as now on the reporter side, there's more overlap than you'd think. So it's kind of harder to break it out that way.
Yeah. You're like, I see you. I see what you're doing there. I speak your language. Sarah, you posted a question here about editorial calendars. Do you want to ask that?
Yeah, it was actually related earlier when we were talking about, just what you're looking for. I know that, and the long lead publications tend to put out, their editorial calendars far in advance so you can take a look and pitch. And then I see a lot of reporters that are on short, lead schedules on Twitter or LinkedIn, and they're kind of putting out like, hey, I'm looking for an expert here. Do you do that? And if so, what channels should our health transformers be following?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do not do editorial calendars, unfortunately. I find that fewer and fewer publications do them recently, or if they do them, they're vague and not as helpful as you would hope that they would be. But I tend to put call outs on Twitter is kind of my main megaphone, I guess we'll call it. But that's my main way of reaching out to folks. I will look to LinkedIn every once in a while, but I would say my main source is definitely Twitter. And usually I like to give myself at least a week lead time. So if I'm asking for, commentary for an article or looking for something, odds are the deadline is a week from then. So being able to be available and make yourself available is always very much appreciated. Even when I know it's kind of a tight turnaround, but usually that's kind of I would say the few things that you can kind of always rely on, especially for Business Insider, is we will always do some sort of lists. That's kind of what Business Insider is known for. Not nearly as much as BuzzFeed, but close enough. And we we'll always do these big kind of year-end review. That's something that we're working on right now as well. It's starting to kind of look for, what are folks predicting for 2021? Kind of what does the landscape look like? What can we expect? And so there's always a big group of stories that come with that kind of project. But otherwise, unfortunately, we don't have anything really set in stone.
Yeah, it's that day-to-day timeliness factor. Like the editorial calendar is what is hot right now, right?
Yep.
What will bring in the audience today. Speaking of social media and Twitter, a lot of the companies who are early stage in healthcare, they're breaking out. You may not have even heard of them yet. They pitch to you, and you immediately have to do a little research about them. And I wanted to ask kind of what you're looking for when you do a quick Google search of a company. Like, okay, are they somebody I want to talk about? What are some of the things that you bump into, some of the, do's and don'ts of somebody's brand presentation to you when you're sort of seeing them for the first time?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is having like a functional, well-designed website. That's kind of the first thing I look for. And that's how I look through, your about page. I look at the team. So making sure, at least the executive team or the leadership team or any other major stakeholders are included with a photo and name. It doesn't necessarily need to be like a bio or anything, but just so I have a face to the name. So if I'm getting an email from a founder, now I can put a face to the email is usually helpful. And that also just kind of helps make it feel like a more legitimate setup. Sure. From there, I go to LinkedIn typically to see how many, and I look at the LinkedIn page of the company to see how many employees are there. And I know LinkedIn is never a perfect estimate, but it does give me an idea of the size, the stage. I know it's also a little bit harder if a company is operating in stealth, but it is something that I look for in terms of growth and size and maturity. And then last is Twitter. It's mostly just to make sure that you're there. I'm not going through your timeline or anything and looking at necessarily what you're tweeting. Usually for that, I would say it's more the CEO or co-founders or whatever it might be, to see if they are someone who is willing to, have a public facing opinion.
Got it. What are some pitfalls, sort of red flags? You sort of mentioned what you're looking for. Are there some things within those categories that really stick out to you as problematic, things to avoid?
Yeah, I would say the biggest one is having, and I know this is hard to kind of get a workaround, but not having a Twitter handle that makes a ton of sense. So for example, like I was saying, I'm covering Papa, and that's a very common word just in the English language and in many other languages. And so if you're looking on Twitter for handles that are Papa, you get some very interesting results. And so they had to kind of get creative with what they listed it, but it also makes it very hard to find. Okay. So if I'm tweeting the story at the end of the day and I would like to tag the company in it, it becomes pretty difficult and adds a lot of friction to that process. So odds are I would forego tagging them. And so then that kind of loses out on the promotional side as well.
Interesting. So that's sort of like the brand side. I'm thinking about What do you look for in a founder? If you're in the market for like a market opinion leader. So obviously, if you're going to write about a company, you want their brand to be at a certain caliber to kind of keep digging and digging. But what are you looking for in an individual, in a professional that you might want to reach out for a quote for? Say, yeah, this is an individual of substance.
Yeah. So I think the first is for someone to have authority to be giving those opinions or that statement. So if you have a background that's not necessarily as a founder, but like maybe you went to medical school or something along those lines, that always helps in terms of being able to speak authoritatively to a certain subject beyond just your role as a founder and CEO. From there, kind of what I was saying before about being able to be available and making yourself available is always very much appreciated. I've worked with folks that are like, oh, well, I'm on vacation the next 2 weeks and then I'm booked solid for the 3 weeks after that. Can we get together, 4 months from now? Which it's not like we have been talking about it. It doesn't quite fit the timeline.
Yeah.
So making time to be available and, reporters operate in a similar work schedule as founders in that we're always on and we're always around. And so we're usually, willing to work around, scheduling and stuff like that. And I had some notes over here. I think the other kind of big thing is having a point of view. I've spoken with a lot of folks that feel that they can't come out on a side of an issue or have kind of a strong opinion one way or the other because they, are nervous about sticking their neck out. Understandably so. But generally, I will go back to someone who is, willing to say something that is a defensible opinion more often than not, because I know you'll actually add to my story versus some boilerplate like, oh, we like just something where it's more marketing or PR language. It's definitely better to have an opinion. And if you can back up that opinion, even better for it. And then we can have a very robust discussion about why that is and how you came to that opinion. And it just kind of flows a lot better versus, giving out a canned statement sometimes is a little bit less interesting, especially for readers.
I think that's a really good point, because there is the idea of telling your story as a company, which you have to be sort of on brand and safe. And then there's the world of publishing where you are trying to grab people's attention, be exciting, engaging, and where those two things intersect, it can be a sort of a tricky, narrow Venn diagram. If anyone on this call has sort of struggled with that, I'd love to hear from you. But I think that is definitely one of the big challenges that anyone trying to get their story out there has, because it's hard to stick your neck out and make a big statement and sort of subject yourself to potential criticism because you have this big opinion. And yet often that's what people are looking for, right? For these stories.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily that you have to be, Mark Benioff or Aaron Levy, where you're making these big grand statements all the time. But, even if it's a personal anecdote or a personal experience or something that kind of ties you to whatever the topic is, people like to read about people. So even kind of sharing an experience that you have and no one else does is another way of kind of making that jump in a way that might feel a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah, interesting. Just to kind of back up a little bit, you mentioned that you came from the PR side. And I wonder, if you could expound on any of the other lessons that transition specifically gave you, because you're able to look at what these companies are trying to accomplish through that lens and not just through the reporter's lens. And also just the fact that, just media and communications have shifted and changed, and the way that we think about PR has changed. So what are some of the other lessons that you've learned along that journey?
Yeah. It's an interesting transition to make. Usually folks go the other way. They go from being a reporter to being in communications because it's a better paycheck and a more steady work-life balance. But generally speaking, I would say it has given me both a healthy skepticism, but also a healthy respect for kind of how startups operate internally. It's the kind of thing where, it's not this very cynical skepticism that I think some reporters do tend to have. It's more of a I understand what you're trying to say and what you're trying to do and accomplish it, but let's work through how to prove it or how to talk about it in a way that is not going to upset your investors, but at the same time, it's definitive proof, that kind of thing. I think it allows me to have those pretty frank discussions in a way that hopefully doesn't come off as brash or anything like that, kind of when working through that process.
Press release or published story on your blog gets it done?
Neither.
Okay, that's fair.
Say, we do not publish blog posts at Business Insider. We do have a.
Oh no, sorry, I didn't mean that. I meant if I tell you we've got news, do you want to see a published press release, or if I've got the news on my blog that you could read about? Do you need it to? Do you need to see it on the wire?
I see what you're saying. So, I would say press releases are helpful in that they give you all of the kind of what I was saying about the pitches earlier, that it gives you all of the information you need to know about the news kind of right in one place. However, putting a release on the wires is costly and not necessarily the best way to get distribution. Because I would say I probably read the first 2 paragraphs of a press release because that's where the bulk of the information is. So that's another tip for writing the pitches is you take what would have been your 2 press release top 2 paragraphs and turn that into an email, and that'll save you a couple $1,000s and also check all the boxes on the reporter side.
Nice. Okay. That's good practical knowledge there. Beth Sanders from Life Bio's got a question.
Hi, Megan. Thanks for being here with us today. I am helping people who are lonely. So we have something called My Hello, where we're actually pairing older people with other older people to reduce loneliness. I just wanted to get your sense on the older market, like age tech today. Do you find that to be kind of a hot topic or not in your world right now?
I would say it's a very blurry line. It depends kind of on, I had mentioned Papa obviously a few times. That has done really well with our readers, and it seems to track pretty well with their interests. Folks are subscribing and reading those articles. However, we've done some stories about mostly in the device realm, where you're kind of working with a physical, tech savvy kind of device for older folks, and that those don't tend to do as well. It's very media, I like to say, is more of an art than a science, unfortunately. But I'd love to take a look and just kind of see what you're working on. It's an area generally that we've been expanding our coverage recently, just as the offerings continue to grow and investors continue to be interested in.
If Megan, if there isn't a big sort of timeliness story or like a tech trend, what about a data story? If there's this many seniors suffering from this issue, and are you looking for numbers stories?
It depends on where the numbers come from. So we will never use proprietary studies. It's just not something that our editorial standards will let us do. So if you partner with a SurveyMonkey or a CB Insights or another kind of respected third-party analytics group, that helps. But if it's just, we polled our members and this is what we found, that data is something then that I have to go verify with someone else to make sure that it tracks. And so by partnering with another group, usually you kind of take that step out of it. So it does help kind of make that more appealing.
Awesome. We got a question from, is that Kim from Clay at Health?
So first of all, I've loved the conversation so far. It's been very exciting. My question is really kind of boring, but kind of not. So it's around COVID. So obviously a lot of people, I think, are burned out, with COVID, but from the standpoint of somebody or groups that are really trying to get in and move the needle, it's almost like a lot of those handcuffs have just been taken off. And so the question is, how are you guys reinvigorated and ready to sort of go back out there and go again? Or, where is it sort of in your algorithm?
Yeah, so I think the vaccine news from yesterday really kind of, everyone woke up again, it felt like. And so I think even from a reader standpoint, we probably did 5 or 6 articles just about the vaccine yesterday across multiple teams. And they all were very highly read, folks were interested, folks were subscribing. Our newsletter this morning was all COVID vaccine news. And it also it performed very well. So we'll see. I think with COVID, it's always hard to predict kind of how things will land. I think the difference is, and my team recently talked about this, is that we're kind of past the point of incremental news as far as COVID is concerned. So it takes kind of the big leaps to really make an impact. So a vaccine, a treatment, new studies, kind of materially new information is what's helping. Some of the more incremental news items are not landing as well because, like you said, I think folks are pretty burnt out.
Okay. All right.
Interesting. Asif Khan from Huku AI, you got a question that kind of ties together Beth's and Kim's.
Yeah, Beth talked about loneliness for seniors, and I think the whole COVID situation, 40%, I don't know what the recent numbers are, but 40% of deaths are kind of in nursing homes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so sad to see that those seniors are kind of unable to see their loved ones and kind of passing away. It's really a bad situation. Just wanted to kind of, I think that is that something that is, top of obviously mind, because the majority of the deaths are happening there. It's like a very hot area. And how that issue of lack of communication, whether it's nurses updating the family members at least, or family members getting updates from the seniors in there, any thoughts on that or any feedback you can give?
Yeah, so I think that was a very big topic right at the beginning of the pandemic. I think there was a lot of news coming out of Seattle and New York City that were both pretty terrifying. And so we really were looking at, what is it about nursing homes that is conducive to the spread of coronavirus? What does this mean for long-term viability for some of these models? We were kind of looking at that side of things for a while. That I would say has taken a step back in recent months. Is not something that we've devoted a lot of time to. However, I think going into the holidays and going into kind of the winter, it will be something that kind of picks back up in terms of a trend. I hope not, to be totally honest. It's not something that we have to worry about and cover, but it's likely that it'll become kind of more pertinent going into the holidays in the next few months.
Thanks, Asif. Shifting gears slightly, a lot of health transformers, entrepreneurs in our portfolio are sort of thinking about like major media pushes for the first time or early in that process. And I wonder, I'd love to get your thoughts on both from your PR background and a Business Insider, like where you think someone's money is best spent when they're thinking about developing content, whether it's content marketing, a PR agency. The goal is the same: get my story out there. Where do you feel like the money is best spent?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have spent time in agencies and in-house and working with folks. So I have kind of the full gamut on this one. But generally speaking, I think it's similar to pitching a reporter in and of itself, and do your research and finding out what specific agencies are known for. If anything, what has actually happened to me a few times is I will have founders reach out to me as a reporter saying, hey, I'm thinking about hiring XYZ agency. As a reporter, is this someone you'd like to work with? Or is this someone you've noticed? Like, do you know who they are? That kind of thing. So they kind of do the back channels on that.
And you respond kindly to that?
Usually, I would say it depends on the week. Depends on what my to-do list looks like. But I do think that's kind of where my PR sympathies come in, where I know how much of a black box it feels like at times. So it's something where if I have the bandwidth to help out, I will at least give a thumbs up or thumbs down, or like I have no idea response. Like there will always be something that I will try to respond to. So I do think it's dependent on what you're looking for. For a big launch, especially if it's your first time, usually an agency that's been through it a million times they will charge you a little more, but they will make sure that you are in front of someone. A lot of my early stage coverage comes directly from VCs. So the folks at the VC firm will reach out and be like, hey, I have this company that is launching next week. Do you want to talk to them? And that's something where, go ahead.
And are you a little more likely to receive that story from them?
Yes.
Because you've got some history maybe.
That's exactly what I was going to say is I'm more likely to, even at the very least, take an introduction because it's, I have built a relationship with a lot of my PR or my VC contacts. And so they know what to send me and what I would be interested in. So usually that means that it's something pretty good. So rely on them if you're able to. They're
interesting.
Very good
Is that pretty universal, or should a founder think about like talking to their investor about making sure that's happening?
I would make sure to talk to the firm to make sure that that's happening, because I know different firms put different kind of weight on that type of coverage.
Okay.
So some firms don't have necessarily a dedicated PR partner, but they might have a marketing partner, that kind of thing. So it's definitely worth asking if it's something that you'd be interested in. If you're looking for less media coverage and more just, kind of a full blitz takeover, go with the agency typically.
Okay. So you described, making sure that you're working with an agency or a PR company that has experience in what you want to do. What about hiring a content writer? What about just getting your story out there in more of an everyday kind of way?
So content writers are great, and they're awesome assets to have on staff. I've noticed that they tend to get hired at earlier stages in startups than, say, a front-facing PR person would. And usually if you hire someone in-house on the PR side, they understand that they're expected to kind of wear every hat under the sun in terms of content writing, social media management, pitching, media relations, kind of the whole 9 yards. And that's obviously my former PR pro bias is showing a little bit, but I would, if anything, go for a PR person, bringing in even a PR contractor full-time before a content writer, because the PR person will be better able to kind of develop your brand voice into something that you can use long-term, even if you maybe don't continue the relationship longer term. It's something that you will always have and always be able to rely on.
Got it. So what I hear you saying is find someone who's got kind of that content strategy piece and, kind of the melding in with marketing versus solely writing.
Yeah.
Which is coming from someone who studied journalism. So are you going against your tribe?
Nah, I don't know. But yeah, I think it is, all that content is great and helpful, but as a reporter, it's not something I have relied on from companies very often. So the return on that, unless it's something that your investors require, or you're, hoping to start putting out white papers in terms of making moves in the industry, that's kind of an entirely different goal with an entirely different answer.
Megan, are there easy ways for people to, look up a great pitch and kind of like review, okay, here's some things that have worked in the past, what to do, what not to do. Is there a guide?
Oh man. That's where the PR agency comes in. They are just have massive databases of everything they've pitched and what has worked and what hasn't, and just so many Excel spreadsheets I could not even tell you. But generally speaking, it's not something that's publicly available typically.
Yeah. That's why we're having this call, isn't it?
Exactly. There are certain databases that will give you access to reporter information. It's not necessarily a pitch, but it will say, this reporter specifically likes to write about healthcare, or this reporter is covering biotech, or whatever it might be. I know one of them is Cision. They were bought by one of the other ones recently. But stuff like that is something that like an agency will have access to.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of help build those repositories.
So the agencies they have that sort of secret knowledge, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not the same world as it was a decade or two ago when they had sort of exclusive gatekeeping to a reporter, right?
Yep. Yeah. If anything, I value when a CEO reaches out or a founder reaches out much more than if a representative or communications manager is reaching out, because I know if even if it may not be a right fit at that time, it's something like, now I have your email address, and I can, if I do have a story 2 weeks from now that is a much better fit, I have a direct line versus going through 4 different people to talk to somebody, and that kind of gets back to that timeliness. It's easier to kind of operate with the flywheel a little bit instead of getting caught at different roadblocks.
That's right. And it also brings up that sort of newsworthy element of celebrity, even though it's not celebrity, it's like at least you're talking to the person whose name means something.
Exactly.
In this story. Asif Khan, you say that you've had experiences both on the PR and the content writing side. If you could sum up kind of your wisdom from that experience briefly, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and I think obviously Megan is the expert here, but just from a founder perspective, I actually would agree with her. But there's a trade-off, right? The cost. So if you hire somebody with PR, which I did at CareMerge, that was fantastic. But I spent about $60,000 a year, right? So, but we got good coverage and all that, and it was money, I think, good spent. This time around, I think I'm more conserving my cash flows and don't necessarily want to dilute myself with Huku.ai as I did with CareMerge. You learn your lessons, but more working on just blogs and content. But that's like $500 a month, right? So for like a blog or content a week or 2 or something like that. So I agree with Meg. I mean, there's no there's no alternative, I guess, to better brand awareness than using PR. But it's expensive. Unless Megan, actually, this maybe you can share some, like, what are the costs these days to kind of get some. I mean, instead of getting a full-fledged agency, are there like freelancers we can leverage, and where to find them to kind of like say, hey, that can work on performance-based PR? Because the challenge with the PR agency, and I think that's why you're kind of dropping off all these like potential of things to avoid is you hire an agency. It may not work, it may work, but you're already down a few $1,000, right, already before you find that out. But if you can find a freelancer who would say, hey, if you get me 1 article, I give you $1,000, or if you give me 2 articles in a place, I give you 3,000. I don't know, some kind of performance-based PR work. Have you seen that, or how do we go about being more creative with that?
Yeah,
good question.
It's not something I've seen when I was on the PR side. It might have been something that has become more popular in the last few years. I will say that I think there is the tricky part about PR is it's very hard to quantify value because in a very monetary way, because what I've seen some PR folks do is, make it comparable to an ad buy. So if you're doing you get a full page story in the New York Times, how does that, that's worth monetarily what one full page ad would be worth. But the way that a reader sees it is much different. So then you kind of have a qualitative aspect that is quite hard to place a specific value on. So I think that's why performance-based has kind of lagged behind other similarly creative freelance work. It's just because, it's great if it's $1,000 for the first article, but what if the first article is, this very small niche blog with 50 readers versus, landing something in the New York Times. Those are just two different outcomes. And so I think it's something everyone struggles with it. I think PR folks struggle with it, content folks struggle with it, and founders struggle with it. It's just something that unfortunately is more of an art than a science. And so it makes it a little bit harder to attach performance-based metrics to it.
Yeah. You bring up an interesting overarching point of this idea of quality versus quantity. You could spend your entire year trying to get that one New York Times piece, and that could be your breakout. And you could spend every day pushing out content to a niche audience and maybe not break out. So it's an interesting thing just for founders to think about.
Mm-hmm. And it's all comes down to strategy, because if you are gunning for a New York Times article, if it takes a year, then you start planning for it a year out. And then you start kind of lay the breadcrumbs along the way. So say, your moonshot is a New York Times article. But, maybe the first few steps is, a TechCrunch feature. Then maybe it's getting featured on Stat. And then maybe it's, working your way up the food chain so that when the New York Times reporter gets your email, they're like, oh yeah, I've heard of this company before. I'll take a look, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Very interesting. I sort of gave you rapid fire questioning, Megan, but kind of summing it all up, kind of thinking about the industry as a whole. You've got a group of a couple dozen health tech founders here, kind of overarching advice for them as they think about telling their story in the market, getting out there in order to achieve their health moonshot.
Yeah, I think kind of the biggest takeaway I would hope to come from something like this is there is value in the media and telling your story through what is an unbiased third party to tell your story. I think sometimes on blog posts and studies and that kind of thing can go either way. But getting a story in Business Insider or the Times or the Journal kind of pays dividends down the road. And it's something that is worth investing in, whether that's your time, which is already in very limited supply, or dollars, and that kind of thing. I do think longer term, it's something that is worth the squeeze down the road.
Yeah. Good insight. All right. Anybody want to share, kind of reflect back what you heard? Is that Kim?
With your message, you were basically sort of subtly very encouraging entrepreneurs to have a voice, sort of regardless of the consequences. And I happen to be pretty bound up with sort of everything that's been going on sort of recently, but I don't think there could be anything more important. So whether that's your personal mission or whether it's Business Insiders, just bravo and thank you.
My big takeaway is read the news and know how you're pitching today, not last week, not even 4 days ago. But if you can tie your story to something happening today, it really speaks volumes, or something that's going to happen tomorrow, right?
If you know something's coming down the road, and you have an opinion or want to make sure it gets seen, a polite heads up is usually very much appreciated.
Yeah. And sort of tying into that kind of puts you in a collaborative relationship with the founder versus this combative, like, please take my story. You're like, I can help you. There's actually something here that it's a win-win situation. Jenny Gallagher from Helpful, you have an aha moment?
Yeah, or takeaway, not sure an aha, but it tied to the other comment, which is, as founders of these startups with big moonshots, I think to in one way or another, we're all sort of have this contrarian view of how we're looking. Like we see the world, and then we see a solution that maybe doesn't look anything like the problem. So what you were saying about tell our story or have a point of view, what really struck me is like, like my whole company and solution looks very different than what's out there. And so I appreciate that, because it kind of gave me another boost of saying, yeah, go out and, make that point. So thank you.
Great.
Well, I think that is a great note to close on. This has been a great session, very practical and also inspiring. Megan, thank you for taking this full hour to kind of pull back the curtain on your work, and I think it's been very helpful. So, thank you so much. Startup Health invests in health transformers from around the world who are committed to achieving audacious health moonshots. If you want to learn how you can join this community of entrepreneurs, or if you want to connect with one of our 330 companies, go to startuphealth.com. Thanks for listening to Startup Health Now. We'll be back next week.